Welcome to New Release Review, part of the Movie Friends podcast. My name is Seth. Today we're talking about Dune Part 2 from 2024, directed by Denis Villeneuve. We will be discussing spoilers for this entire episode, and so if you haven't seen Dune 2, I don't know what you're doing, but you should turn this off, go watch the movie, and then come back and listen. Today, I'm very excited. I think we set this up like a year ago, so it's fun to actually be doing this now. My guest today is Paul Trygstad, aka Trigraptor, aka Paul Muad'dib. We're here to talk about Dune 2. Finally, Paul, how are you?
Seth, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm recovering from my my spice overload in the theater.
A little bit of a spice trip, yeah.
Yes. So you and I met through Twitter.
We did.
Talking about movies. And I think I've always known you as Paul Muad'dib. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's probably right. I've been Paul Muad'dib for like 2 years now. I don't believe in changing my screen name because every time one of my friends does, I lose them. So,
right. Yes, I agree. It's the worst when someone changes their profile picture and display name at the same time. And I'm like, I have no idea who you are.
And if the handle goes, it's, it was nice knowing you. I hope we meet again in your new life.
Right. Pretty much. Yeah. But yeah, yours is a very recognizable face and name. Pretty consistent.
Thank you.
And like I said, I can't even remember when I asked you to do this. Normally I don't have these episodes lined up like a year in advance, but
yeah, and I'm trying to remember if it was before the delay because that also protracted things.
Probably. Yeah. When was this originally supposed to come out?
November 3rd, I believe. Not that I marked it on my calendar or anything. Not that I was greatly anticipating this date.
Right. I think I remember that because I believe that's like right around my birthday. My birthday's the 4th.
Oh.
And so I remember thinking like, oh, okay, I'll probably do Dune 2 for my birthday. And yeah.
I was looking into moving my birthday around that time just for that year because I wanted to coincide. So
there's a lot to talk about. I have a lot of thoughts. I'm sure you have 3 times as many thoughts as I do. But off the bat, what are your just kind of initial thoughts, impressions from, I know you're just coming off of your second theater viewing.
I am, yeah. I saw it. I was lucky enough to see it on the 25th for the early fan release, and I just got out of another showing, matinee with my mom, so that was really fun. My initial thoughts is it's an absolutely tremendous movie. It's what I really hoped for the whole time between Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2, that it'd be basically a giant movie of payoff from all the setup from the first part. And I felt like it delivered on that on pretty much every level. How about you, Seth? How did you feel about it? You're also coming fresh off a viewing of it, right?
Yeah, I just got back like a few hours ago.
Great.
I read Dune probably about 14 years ago.
Okay.
Just fell absolutely head over heels in love with the story from the first few chapters, having no idea what anything meant. Looking back into like the little glossary and that they have, and I'm like, who are who? And am I supposed to know what all this stuff is? I read it through twice and then checked out the Lynch version and loved it because I'm a lifelong science fiction fan. And I think whenever you are a fan of any genre, you're able to kind of weed through the good and the bad and appreciate it just that it exists. And so that's how I felt about Dune. And when they announced that they were doing Dune Part 1, I was like, that seems dumb because it's kind of too big to do. And then it was revealed. I'm beating around the bush a little bit, but I left Dune Part 1 excited, but a little let down because to me, it ended right where the story gets going.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone who's like, this is the best movie ever. I was like, that's not even half the story. So if you liked that, you're going to really like what actually happens. And I think more nervous going into Part 2 than I was into Part 1 because I was like, okay, they left so much stuff. I see the parts that they cut and how they streamlined things, removed storylines that seemed like they were really necessary, and I guess they kind of weren't. I enjoyed it. I think it looks fantastic. I think the part of the movie, and this is going to sound crazy, I'm sorry for all of the real big Dune heads out there who are like squirming in their seats. When the movie really grabbed me is when Paul is addressing the Fremen, and it's like Dark Paul suddenly. And that's when I was like, oh, okay. Chalamet is convincing. He's convincing. And even if he, as a character of Paul, is like putting on an act, whether or not he fully believes or not himself, I can see a difference in how he's portrayed Paul. Because that's kind of been my biggest thing thus far is like, I like Chalamet. I think that he's a great actor. I love him in pretty much everything I've seen him in. I just have never really seen him as Paul Atreides until that scene. And then I was like, oh, this is awesome. Like,
Right on.
really, really good. Yeah.
Do you see Kyle MacLachlan or McLachlan still as Paul Atreides?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I always saw Paul as like a little bit more like disciplined and militaristic. Just in reading the book. And it's like they picked the two most like white bread wafer boys to portray him. And no shade to Kyle MacLachlan. He's great,
Something about Paul Atreides cinematically said twink to the various auteurs who picked that up.
I guess so. I don't know if they were just taking the whole like Muad'dib thing like really seriously. Like they were like, oh well, yeah, he's supposed to be like a little mouse
kangaroo rat build,
Yeah,
it's supposed to have long legs and a tail, big ears. If I could sidebar really quick just to explicate for anyone curious about how I came to Dune, my actual first introduction was the sci-fi miniseries. And I think I saw it when I was like 8. And I remember, the main character's name was Paul. My name was Paul. When you're 8, that's about all you need to get into a story. And then there's Big Worm, so I was super into it. But then I had started reading the book in anticipation for Dune Part 1. I'd heard Denis Villeneuve was doing one. I'd really liked Arrival and Blade Runner. And then going to see Part 1, I had read about half of the book. I'd read pretty much exactly where it stopped. And I had no idea if it was going to be Dune or Dune Part 1. I hadn't looked into it. I wasn't on Twitter very much. And so when I got there, I think I was the only person like where it ended. I was like, yes, like I don't want to know the end of this story.
Got it.
So I've been like, yeah. And something about Dune Part 1 for me, that's like kind of the movie I would say birthed me as a more hardcore film fan. There was it just lit my brain on fire. And I'd always liked movies, but from that point I was like, nah, I need to see all the movies. Like I need to know what an apocalypse now means because everyone's making that comparison or various sci-fi films I hadn't seen. So, I owe a lot to Dune Part 1. That's why I'm here to some degree.
I always love when people can point to a movie or like a experience. So many people who are like really into movies will say like, well, I was just always into movies. Right. It's like, they were always around. And I mean, that's my story too. But I very specifically remember the first time I watched 12 Angry Men.
Yeah.
And then watching it every day, sometimes 2 times in a row for a month straight.
Mm-hmm.
Not even studying it, like just experiencing it.
Like I just need to bask in this.
Yeah. And a lot of people will knock Denis for Blade Runner 2049. And that even liking that film has become like a meme, which I don't understand.
I'm so unaware of that I am certain I am the meme.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like this idea of like you ask a certain type of person, like, oh, what's your favorite movie? And they're like, Blade Runner 2049. Who cares if that's what it is? You know what I mean? I remember the first film of his that I saw was Prisoners. We went to see it in theaters, my wife and I. At the time, I think our son was maybe 7 or 8 months old.
Yeah.
And we were so
It's a
scared
rough
when
parent
we
movie.
left the theater. We immediately called my parents, who were home with him. We're like, is he okay? What's going on? We had a plan to go do like one or two things after the movie. We immediately just drove home.
Like, do you see any RVs on the street?
Right.
Is there any ominous trees outside?
And so since then, I was like, oh, I got to check out everything that this guy does. And so, yeah, but I think that he gets a really unfair bad rap from people.
He's been on, you know, quite a streak for a really long time now, and it seems like it's finally like turned on him that's a bad thing, because now it's uncool to like Denis Villeneuve. But that's probably a sign of success. I remember when Nolan went through the same thing, I think right before Tenet.
People are always coming at people who are successful or are having a good run, like you said. I mean, yeah, we just published 5 seconds before I came on with you. Andrew Corns wrote an article that was just doing a whole career retrospective of his.
Oh, fantastic.
And I was reading it and I was like, I know this stuff, but this is still really interesting. And like, yeah, like this guy's really got an eye and a talent. And I know people were freaking out the other day because he made a statement about how he doesn't care for dialogue. And that kept going through my mind as I was watching Dune 2 in the theater. I was like, yeah, this guy doesn't like dialogue.
Yeah. He's not big into it. A lot of times when it's there, you feel like it was added in post, because it's like, you know, subtitles, Harkonnen or Fremen.
Right.
And you're like, he was just trying to tell without words this whole section. Yeah, controversially though, I agree with him. You know, he made that statement that movies have been corrupted by TV, and not to, you know, stick my neck out here too far, but I see what he says, because a lot of television is like people walking into different locations and discussing the plot or discussing their relationships. Television's really more of a writer's exercise in my mind, where cinema is a visual exercise. And I mean, that's just something that's come up a lot in the discussion of Dune. Like, oh, it would work much better as a TV show, ideally. And I see that argument from the story side, but I'm so happy we got 2 movies instead of, you know, 6 episodes.
Well, yeah, you could certainly do Dune as a TV series. So go and do it.
Yeah.
Sure, let's see that version. Are you going to actually do it?
The Sci-Fi Channel.
Okay, well, this is the version that we have, and this is his version of it. I don't think that he fully means what people took that to mean, as if he would sit down and watch 12 Angry Men and be like, this is garbage.
Yeah.
They're just talking. Like,
it causes him physical pain anytime somebody talks in a movie.
He's talking about his style. There's nothing wrong with knowing your style and your way of doing things and how he prefers to do things and what he's good at. A lot of the time when I'm watching Dune, Arrival, Dune Part 2, some of the most awe-inspiring moments are just when spaceships are moving silently. I don't know if you get that same feeling.
Absolutely. It's this sense of weightlessness with this really big thing, and you're like, wow, that is cinema.
It's crazy. I mean, it's such a simple part of it, but every time it happens on screen, I'm like, oh. Or in this one, when Gurney just jumps off the side of the ship and just slowly floats down.
It looks so fun. I want to do that so bad.
Yeah, like it's not a jetpack, right?
Right.
It's not flying. It's not floating. It's this other thing that, you know, I'm sure the effects team, we're in this like weird auteur mindset these days where we're like, oh yeah, this is the way that Denny did it. And it's like, no. He didn't sit there and animate that stuff. What are you talking about? They showed it to him. He was like, great.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because I think auteur theory for what it is, like everyone is buying into just like a little too much. It's like there's a lot of people who worked on these movies, like a lot of people, and they deserve credit because their work is amazing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you know, I don't know what the budget for this film was, but
190 million is what I've seen.
Yeah, that's going to pay people to do this.
Yeah, right. He's just pocketing the money and doing it like late nights on the weekend.
The style in this, it does create a sense of awe in you. I think because, maybe we're just used to seeing Star Wars. Everything is propulsion, right? When
Right.
things take off, you feel the start and stop of it. Where in this, like you said, it's like weightlessness, and it's eerie, but it's interesting, and it creates like wonder in your mind.
Yeah, it compared to like a jetpack or some. I just saw the Rise of Skywalker last night actually, so that's a pretty good comparison piece with the catapulting
Yeah.
stormtroopers, and it's very, like you said, propulsive. It's bombastic. It's energetic.
Yeah.
Whereas like in Dune Part 2, when those guys climb that ridge in the beginning and they just levitate off, it's like this sense.
Yeah.
You just like, I felt my body do the same thing. I was like, whoa,
Yeah.
that's nuts. There's a tactility to it too, I think, because I don't know what a jetpack feels like, but I could imagine being weightless. Maybe that doesn't make sense.
Right.
But
the special effects team behind this movie, they have such a gift in Herbert's setup for this universe, which is no thinking machines.
Right. This sort
and
of.
So, yeah, like sci-fi is, oh, we have a problem in the story. Oh, well, this magic box does it. Okay. Yeah. Grab the magic box. Now the story continues. That's what's so great about it. Like I don't view that as a limitation of sci-fi. I love the magic box.
Yeah,
I love when
absolutely.
they get into the thing and it does the whoever's.
Hey computer, tell me the answer.
But this is like sci-fi with a serious limitation that I'm curious if people haven't read the book, if they're aware that this is the universe that these characters live in, that, thinking machines are outlawed. And, that's why you have like the mentats and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I could see that going over the heads of some casual viewers, but I guess on the credit of the film, it really does like give you just in the production design that kind of detail, because they're all using these sort of analog machines or have no machines, like in a lot of the shots. But where they do, like you see Princess Irulan's recorder is like a manual thing, or analog recorder, and their spaceships are all, the ornithopters all fly with like switches and stuff. There's seemingly no autopilot.
Yeah, when Paul sends a message to the Emperor and it's like on a scroll, like it's a metal scroll. It's a little futuristic, but I was like, well, just send an email. Like, what are you doing? Right. Like, you think I'm going to believe that this little scroll made it all the way from Arrakis to, like, this seems so...
Just tweeting about it. Hashtag Muad'dib time.
Right, exactly. But then you stop and think like, oh, no, that's right.
Yeah, it's that primitive futurism, and I forget who coined that term, but yeah, I think the production design captures that so well.
Yeah, it's something that makes Dune, the world of Dune, like so special and so interesting. And that we're having sword fights.
Yeah.
In the future, like
with shields, with like space shields.
Yeah. I mean, I can't really think of a time, Lucas updates that to be lightsabers. And so you're still having sword fights, but it's futuristic sword fights.
Yeah, the
in
laser
Dune,
sword.
It's like, no, this is made from a tooth. Okay. So I have some questions for you. We already kind of talked about Timothée Chalamet as Paul.
Timothée Chalamet as Paul.
How did you feel about him in this movie? How did you feel about how they handled his kind of emergence?
Yeah, I thought it was brilliant. I think Timothy has always had this role and is in the bag. I know in Dune Part 1 he doesn't really get to flex his, Muad'dib muscles. But that scene where he decides to kill Jamis in the duel, you can see something happening in his eyes that's like, there he is. So, yeah, and I love his hesitancy. I don't know. When I read the book, the phrase that stood out to me the most, I think, was terrible purpose, his terrible purpose. And I think Timothy really embodies that by being, moody, sad boy for a good portion of the movie. And then becoming very... not sure sinister is the right word, but there's definitely that quality when he's talking to the Fremen that, like you said, dark Paul, less than what is the line from the book? Less than a god, more than a man. I think he gets to that point pretty well by the end.
Yeah.
Without feeling too forced in my mind, or too rushed rather.
I think the easiest thing for people to relate this to would be the moodiness of Anakin Skywalker in the prequel trilogy.
Absolutely.
And while some people take offense or annoyance to that, and then also put that onto Kylo Ren, right, in the sequel trilogy, they're like, oh, well, he's throwing a fit. It's like, right. And that's partially what makes it scary, is that he's not a person like, Hannibal Lecter, who's all in control, right? There's no emotion involved.
Right.
Paul is scary in this movie because he really doesn't want to do X, Y, and Z because he knows what it's going to lead to. And he's trying. And finally he's like, okay, fine. He can't escape, the path laid before him. It's not that he just becomes like a robot, like a killing machine. He has feelings, he has emotions, and those go from like depressed and sad to angry and explosive. And that's scary.
Right. And we know he has that anger from the beginning too, because he's, talking about revenge towards the beginning of the movie. Kind of seems like he gets into the Fremen culture a little bit and leaves that behind. But when he starts getting into it at the end, it's like that repressed rage starting to peek out. And I think you see that too.
I loved the line, your father didn't believe in revenge. He's like, yeah, I do.
Yeah, I do though.
I was like, whew. Very, very simple. And you could say maybe doesn't fit with the setting. I liked it. I thought that was great.
I agree.
I think that we get the flip side of that towards the end where the Emperor is like, your father was a weak man.
Right. Although I think at that point, Paul has already said, like, you have to pay for my father.
Yeah.
So, that rage is coming out. And then I saw that just as Shaddam just pushing his buttons, like, like, you kid, get off my lawn. Your dad was a whip too, but
I could not get over, and I can't wait to get some screen grabs of this. I could not get over how much Timothée Chalamet with the
that nose piece
looks like Charlie Chaplin in this movie.
Yeah.
Like, it was just, I was like, they had to see this. Like, come on, man. It's crazy.
Yeah, there's one other mustached guy that kind of invokes too. Spoilers for Dune Messiah, but
right. Luckily, he doesn't. Luckily, Chalamet looks more like
Charlie Chaplin with his fair features. Yeah, yeah. But speaking of screen grabs, like basically every shot this movie on second watch, especially, I was just like, oh, I can't wait for home release so I can screen grab this. Like, oh, I can't wait for home release so I can screen grab this. It's just so many iconic shots and just beautiful framings of things.
The scene where they're taking down the harvester and they're running in between the legs as they're moving. I was like, how are they doing this?
There's a scene right before he gives that salute in the third act that is, the big gif from the movie.
Yeah.
And he like turns and he smiles at Gurney, like, and it's just like the most classic like anime hero pose I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I was like, that's like, I need this as an image immediately.
I got really big anime vibes, more so this time around. Just a lot of the practical suits, specifically when Robin is in they're in the ship and they're looking for all the Fremen, and that dude, the one dude who's like, he's got this whole face piece on with like cables coming out of the sides. I was like, man, I feel like I'm watching Ghost in the Shell or something. Like,
and he's kind of just smashing his guys around the whole time, like he's an animated person.
Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I was like, I know that they were talking about Taika Waititi doing a live action Akira, but I think that maybe giving Akira to Denis would be better.
I would be a little more down to see Denis' version of Akira than Taika Waititi's, but maybe I'm in the minority on that.
No, I think he could pull it off. You already had mentioned him. Maybe my least favorite part of this movie, Christopher Walken.
Okay.
How'd you feel about him?
I'll admit I was a little underwhelmed on first watch. It was like, hey, he was there. Like, great that he was there. um,
Yeah.
on second watch, I think I appreciate his performance a little more. He's just old and annoyed. He just doesn't want to do this. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of like knowingness to that performance, but like a lot of
Hmm.
the performances in Dune, at least I feel they're very subtle. There's a lot of it's like really there's a lot of minutia there to mine, but it's
Yeah.
a lot of condensed elements from the book that they're trying to summarize in like little facial gestures and whatnot. So yeah,
Right.
I thought in rewatch he worked a lot better for me. You could see some of the complexities, and then his sort of scorched earth moment where he starts unloading on Leto Atreides as Paul has just defeated his entire army.
Right. I don't know. I felt like for both movies, casting pretty great. I was fine with some of the roles that got swapped out. And I don't know. I just believed everybody, I guess, in all of their
Yeah.
different roles. I remember people were like, Zendaya, Chani. I don't know about that, but I think she does, a great job as Chani. But Christopher Walken, I couldn't get over it. I just couldn't. Like, I felt like he's acting. I think that
Okay.
there's a generation of people who only know Christopher Walken as like the goofy Christopher Walken guy,
Yes.
kind of like Jeff Goldblum.
Okay. Yeah.
Like, people don't remember a time when Jeff Goldblum was like an actor. Like, it
Yeah.
just
It's like
doing his Jeff Goldblum thing. And I will say Walken is not doing his Christopher Walken thing. He's acting. It just felt like I wanted put someone else in this role and I can see them as the Emperor. I'm just seeing Christopher Walken. And that's what it felt. That's for me. Like,
okay.
I was just being, because like you said, he's not doing a lot. He's just kind of around. He's like muttering,
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of Christopher Walken movies, and I'm kind of a late comer to all things cinema, honestly. Like I
Mhm.
said, Dune Part One was the one that was like, go forth and watch movies.
Sure.
But yeah, recently I had seen The Dead Zone with Christopher Walken, and so
Sure.
that's
Yeah.
kind of what this performance, out of all of his, sort of, it's obviously a very different role, but it was the most similar to that, just in terms of the seriousness and the gravity.
Right.
I don't know if you saw the interview a couple of years ago where he said that at some point he just stopped getting phone calls, and I think a
Wow.
lot of us collectively went like, "Who are you to not put Christopher Walken in your movie? Like how is that
Right.
happening?" So I think his performance in Dune Part Two, with that knowledge, he has this sort of scorn throughout the film. It's a little
Yes.
understated, but
Yeah.
I almost felt like he had a little bit of a vengeance he was coming back with too, just after having been somewhat forgotten for so many years.
Sure.
So that's, yeah, I felt that into his performance, and that made it a little better for me, maybe.
Well, I loved that we didn't get it spelled out for us in the second one. The first one, it's mentioned how he's a jealous man.
Mm-hmm.
And in the second one, when he gives his explanation, he goes into all these negative things about Leto instead of how he actually feels, which is, jealousy and fear. And we don't have to go too far outside of our own political world to see old men who refuse to give up power.
Right.
Despite having capable people of being able to take over for them. And so I liked that. I just felt like Walken didn't make that happen. It was the writing that made all of those things happen.
Right. And I agree with that. But I think part of that might be just Denis' style too, right? Because he doesn't want to give us that dialogue scene where we have that spelled out for us.
Right.
He'd rather just show him drop the scroll, and you're like, yeah, he's mad.
Right. It's a close up on the chessboard between him and his daughter, not them talking. That's important.
Right. Although I do really like the scene they get together where they're talking, and he's almost like quizzing her, like, what would you do?
Yeah.
And he kind of gives her like thumbs up at the end of the session.
Yeah. And that's a parallel between Leto and Paul from the first movie.
Yeah, that scene with Jessica and Paul that opens Part One, where she's quizzing him to use the voice. I felt Dune Part Two, in that sense, sort of framed the whole idea of Dune as sort of these trained children trained to carry on these big legacies of great houses.
Yeah.
and I think it brought out the sort of YA elements of Dune in the best way.
Mm, mm,
That was a big takeaway I had from the film, especially with like the love story and the focus on the familial relationships.
right, right, right. Speaking of the love scenes, Zendaya actually has lines and things to do in this movie,
Yes.
unlike the first one. How did you feel about how they changed? In the book, there are some things that are taken out. We're missing the child that they have, and they lose because we're not doing the time jump in the book where you have a period of a few years that pass,
Right.
where Paul is wrestling with the future. He's learning the ways of the Fremen. He has a kid. There's Jameis's family, which is all removed, and all of that stuff. And so I understood why, and I think I'll talk about that later when we
Sure.
talk about the next movie. But how'd you feel about her, Chani's kind of expanded role, different role in this?
I'm a fan personally. There's not a lot to work with on the page for Chani in my mind,
Yeah,
especially in Dune Part One. She gets a lot more to do
yeah,
in Messiah, but I think there was a necessary expansion of who she was, and I think how they chose to go about it by inserting her within the machinations of the political struggle and the religious
yeah.
struggle, and then a little bit with the prophetic stuff as well. I thought it was an interesting and smart weaving that made it feel a little more organic and a little less like, hey, Zendaya's in this movie too.
Right.
Yeah, so I was a fan of it, and I don't think any of it, and I would say this about pretty much all the adaptational changes that this movie made. To me, none of it really removed any key elements of the story, and none of it added something that felt really at odds with Frank Herbert's work. How did you feel about it, Earl?
I see why they did it, and I think that it is going to play into the next movie. I mean, this movie ends the same way that the first one does, with Zendaya being like, "Hey, what does she say in the first one?
This is
This
only
is
the
just the
beginning.
beginning."
Yeah,
Right. In this one, she could be, looking at the camera and saying, "Well, this is the ending. This is the end of, me and Paul." But both movies end with her heading out into the desert. And
true.
if you know anything about the next story with Paul and all that stuff, I'm curious to see if that comes around a third time. But
Can I ask, did you take it as her leaving Paul at the end of this movie? Because I actually didn't feel that way, which is maybe strange because looking at it, I get that interpretation, but I sort of felt like she just got in a car to like speed off and he's like, she'll be back kind of
right, right,
idea.
right.
I don't know.
I think she feels a great sense of betrayal that he
Yes.
became a leader because the Fremen have no leaders. They're
Yes.
all equal. And he says to her, she's like, you're an outsider. And he's like, well, no, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, no, you'll be, you're Fremen to me, right?
Yeah. You're no foreigner to me.
And for him to, in one fell swoop, without telling her what's going to happen ahead of time, be like, by the way, I'm getting married. Also, I'm the emperor. Also, we're going to go wage war against all of the great houses now. Like, it's not about Arrakis and the Fremen. Actually, I'm going to take the Fremen and turn them into soldiers to do my bidding. That's a betrayal on every level, romantically, spiritually. He's buying into all the prophecy stuff that she's been dead set against the entire movie.
Yep.
He's using the Fremen now. What happened to turning Arrakis into a paradise? I definitely think she's like, all right, I'm done. Like I'm leaving, and I don't know where she's going to, because she's part of the Northern Tribe, which was also I got why they did that. That's also like a departure in the book of having like the Southern Hemisphere believing in the prophecy that way
Yeah.
more,
Like a
and
fundamentalist center in
yeah,
the South.
yeah,
And that's the kind of thing too that like I'm okay with those changes because I think it actually adapts a lot of the ideas of the novel because there's a lot of complexity between the sieges that we don't have time to get into in the film.
yeah,
And so they're like, let's, make this very easy for the audience. I feel like Lord
yeah,
of the Rings did a lot of similar maneuvers and how they were kind of like,
sure.
this kingdom is now this city.
Well, yeah, and it's like, hey, there's elves.
Yeah.
They're not different elves. Maybe, kind of. It's just they're all elves,
Yeah. Don't worry about it. They've got elf things to do.
Right, right. I think much like the first one, Dune Part 1 came out and they had not greenlit Dune Part 2.
Yeah.
And
It's a nervous
we know
time.
that they're working on Dune Messiah, but it hasn't officially been greenlit yet. And so it, much like Dune Part 1, it would be ridiculous to end it this way. Like that is setting up for a third movie.
I'm gonna take the controversial stance that if this was it, it'd be a fantastic ending. It would be
Wow.
It would be the story of a person who comes in, capitalizes on a prophecy for their own personal gain, and we get Chani, who's both the idealized vision of Arrakis and also this indigenous person who's like, I'm out.
Yeah.
Totally screwed over.
How did you feel about Austin Butler as Fade Rotha?
I loved it. He's a freaky guy. I love his Stellan Skarsgård impersonation.
Yeah, I mean, he decided definitely to not deviate from what Stellan did in the first movie.
And controversially, the voice, there was so much anticipation of like, oh, is he going to sound like Elvis still? Like, what's the Fade voice? And I did keep that for myself until I saw the movie. I was like, I'm not going to hear the voice. So as soon as he turned around, I was like, oh, he's doing Stellan Skarsgård. How lovely.
I liked their time on Getty Prime.
I thought the Getty Prime stuff was just amazing.
I wanted to see more of those crazy horned dudes with spears.
How did you feel about the black and white, the black sun of Getty Prime?
I liked it. I was into it. We're in sci-fi. Do sci-fi stuff.
Yeah.
That's how I feel.
I like the idea too that it was a sci-fi effect that could have been achieved in, the 60s or 70s. Like just, oh, this world's black and white.
Right. Yeah. And like their version of fireworks was like dropping food coloring in water. Which was quite interesting.
Made no like physical sense, but you see it and it's like, yeah, that's really cool. Ink blots.
Right. Yeah. No. Hey, things don't have to make sense if they're cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I think Dune understands really well.
Yeah.
The best of sci-fi does.
Yeah, Butler was good. I wish that we had a little bit more of the Baron in this one. The Baron was he was physically imposing, but also just like psychologically imposing, where Fade was more just physically imposing. I don't know. I'm not really saying that. I didn't feel, I felt terrified of the Baron.
Yeah.
Like anytime he was around and doing things, I was like, yeah, this guy's messed up. With Fade, I was like, yeah, he would slice my throat, but I'm not like disturbed just by looking at him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just liked his sort of violence that he just oozed at all times. You could just tell that he was just wanting to kill stuff. And I actually thought he had really nice chemistry with Stellan Skarsgård as the Baron.
Yeah.
When their time together, I was like, oh, this is some, quality Dune stuff right here.
Yeah. All the Harkonnen stuff I really, really liked. Rabin, just nothing working out for him ever, killing people all the time, and
kissing
the whole kiss my shoe thing.
Yeah,
I wanted like a little bit more with them, which I think is the sign of a good villain, right? You always want more screen time with them, and then when the movie's over, you're like, oh, they were actually on screen for like only 10 minutes. That sucks.
And that's
but then it's like, if you show them more, does it lose some of that effect?
Exactly. And that's largely how I felt with the Baron in part 1. I think he's probably on screen for 4 minutes or something like that. But has like this huge presence, very imposing.
Yeah.
And I did feel like he was taken down a peg in this one. He's more vulnerable. He's hanging out in hot tubs and smoking. He's a little more humanistic, but I thought it was a nice way to kind of reconcile him with the more mustache twirling book version just a little bit. He felt a little more familiar in that sense.
Yeah, the Lynch version of the Baron I thought was a little closer to the Baron in the book.
Absolutely.
Skarsgård is giving, I guess if I were to look at like this decade, right, of villains, I'd be like, yes, Stellan Skarsgård, Baron Harkonnen, up there, amazing. And then with Fade, it's like, it's great, it's good. And I guess that's what's heartbreaking for me about this being split into two movies is you can see how it is like one story and it's really like ramping up to a fight between two people
Yeah.
with knives. But you learn all these things about them and you learn why it's important that it comes down to, you know, Paul and Fade.
Yes.
And it's not just like, oh, he's the strong guy in our group and he's the strong guy in our group. It's like, no, these are literally the two options. What did they say? 90 generations or whatever?
Yeah, it's the pool of two Kwisatz Haderach applications.
And it like, you know, and it comes to Fade isn't just, oh, like I'm an evil guy and I'm going to kill Paul. It's like, no, he's the Emperor's champion. And so there's everything behind that. And you have, you know, the Fremen are on one side of the room and everyone with the Emperor is on the other side of the room. And it's like, you have two champions representing two extreme different classes of people, planets, ways of living, and whoever loses, the other people are going down like permanently. It can seem like the story ends with a knife fight, but it's not. Like, it's so much more is riding on just this like knife fight.
Right. I think it's so interesting too in that context when Paul says, "It's nice to finally meet you." It's like, oh yeah, these guys have never they've never met each other before.
Right.
With the final boss fight. But yeah, absolutely. And for me, I like the intimacy of it all coming down to a duel. And I think they made a smart choice to end part one where they did. I know it was a little controversial, like you were saying at the top, but to parallel those, you know, knife fights that changed everything, if you will.
Right.
It's nicely done.
One of my favorite parts of the book is when you finally see that there is water. Yep. And that there's not just water, but there's an incredible amount of water. And I felt like that in this was just kind of, I don't want to say blown past, but like they didn't dwell on it as much as they do when it's revealed in the book.
Right. They also changed the mechanics of how he threatens the spice, because in the book it is with water. And it's that, to me, that's a really interesting change, because that was one I was really interested in how they'd approach that, because he threatens to destroy the spice. In the book, it's really unclear what the mechanics of how he's pulling that off are. It's like a bunch of water from the siege over a spice blow, but that connects the whole planet. I've asked a lot of people about this. No one seems to actually like get that. And in this one, he's like, I'm going to nuke the spice.
Right.
And it's like, oh, well, yeah, I guess that requires less explanation of how that works. But it does make it a little more militaristic and a little less chemical, I guess. Like chemical reaction, ecological, maybe the word.
Right. Which, you know, that would go back to Herbert's like inspiration for this whole thing is sand, and sand taking over, and water and sand being in opposition to each other, and how the world is changing and all of that stuff. But yeah, nukes are good too.
What a plot twist to see that Paul Atreides has the arsenal from the end of Oppenheimer just chilling in a cave.
Yeah, I was like, okay. When they were like, yeah, we hid it here. And Stilgar was like, we didn't find it, or, you know, we weren't looking for it. I was like, how did they do that? Like, I need a little bit of explanation as to how that happened, because that doesn't seem to jive with everything else that we know about the Fremen, and whatever. Oh, well.
Yeah, the little plot hole just big enough to fit a nuke through, but
right.
It's like shooting wombats from a cave.
So how did you feel about the worm riding and the worm cavalry? And
so I loved the worm riding. I gotta tell you exactly why. Every other adaptation, worm riding is always great, but the design of the worm always has these recurving scales that doesn't make sense how you get the hook underneath it, because it's like they curve back the wrong way. And that's like a detail that always bothers me. Like in the Lynch version, you know, they're hooking on, but you're like, what? How are they? Like they had to hook on the other way, but in this one, Denis Villeneuve has clearly thought for a really long time, like how the scales would fit so you could pull these little ones
Yeah.
up. And I just adored the tactility of it all and the sense making. And in general, I'm a really big fan on their take on the sandworms. There's a verisimilitude with them that it's the spice.
Yeah, yeah. I love the design. I love the character that they put into the worms.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they pulled that off quite well. I mean, I can't remember if it was in the first trailer or the second trailer for the first one where we see the worm just kind of like rear back and like stare at Paul. And I was like, oh my God, this is going to be the best movie I've ever seen.
Yeah. The Worm Cavalry is also great. I mean, I could watch Worm Cavalry for like 2 hours. So of course I could have done with more of it. But I do like the idea too, that once they enter the playing field, it's basically over. They just plow through.
Yeah. I was so surprised that that final battle was like 3 minutes long. It felt like,
yeah. And I wasn't disappointed because again, I thought the images were great. Maybe a few too many shown in the trailer, for those of us who did that. But at the same time, it does, I think, actually adapt a sensation from the book, because I remember reading that chapter and it just felt like suddenly we won.
Right. So I want to ask you about. Have you read Dune Messiah?
I have read Dune Messiah and I've read Children of Dune. I haven't read beyond that yet. But yeah.
Based on the changes that they made, and at this point, this isn't spoilers because they made several changes, and so kind of anything could happen.
Yes.
Based on the changes that they made, do you have any predictions for the next movie?
I have probably no predictions for the next movie. I have no idea how they're going to approach it. And let me just say, if this movie was like 100% book accurate, I would still have no idea how they're approaching Dune Messiah.
Interesting.
As the third movie, because it's such a different beast to adapt. It feels much more Shakespearean to me and much smaller scale in certain ways, even though the scale described is huge, but the dramatis personae is a little smaller and more intimate.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really difficult text to approach. I guess if I was going to make one prediction, it would be that Alia gets a lot more to do similar to what she does in Children of Dune, how she's a little more, I don't want to spoil anything, but she has a little bit more ruling power in the later novels. And I would expect to see a little more of that out of this.
Yeah, them choosing, it's kind of like some of the things where it's like, oh, how are they going to handle this? And there's like, oh, they're just not going to. Yeah. That's how they handle it.
like Alia, the demon toddler.
Alia just becomes, the speaking baby.
How did you feel about that?
I was okay, except for all the times that Jessica was just talking to herself.
Oh, okay.
I was like, this is a little corny. Like, just walking around these like caverns being like, no, we can't do that. It's like, okay. I definitely think that they did a good job of, they really bump up the story of like the control of religion and how it's being used to manipulate these people over centuries. And I thought Rebecca Ferguson did an incredible job of turning very sinister at some parts.
Yeah, she was like scary, right?
Yes.
There are moments where it's like oh my gosh.
Yes. Because in the first movie, you're really feeling for her the majority of the time. She's scared for Paul. She's scared for Leto.
Yeah.
She's capable. She's killing people and taking control. And you're really like, oh man, I'm on this person's side. Maybe more than Paul's, because Paul is still like a little kid.
Just kind of going with the flow. Yeah.
Yeah. And then in this one, it's like, holy moly.
Yeah, I like what they did with her a lot, especially because she sort of disappears in a lot of the latter half of Dune the novel. And you sort of just hear that she's been doing just this, like building upon the legend, but you don't get to like see that. And yeah, I thought it was very cool and just very well performed.
I think for me, with all of the changes in the book, all I say is I get it. I get why they did it.
Right.
I get why they took out, I don't know how you pronounce his name, Thufir.
Right.
Thufir.
Yeah.
I get why they didn't do that whole storyline.
Sure.
We have Lisa Doe. come in and get pregnant, and that's kind of it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And how did you feel about her scene? Because I feel like it didn't need to be there, but I'm so happy it was.
I mean, the only thing that I'll say is I think that is going to play big into the next movie.
Oh, yeah.
And that's probably the only reason it was there, because it had really no bearing on this movie other than to be like, hey, Fade, we can use sex and humiliation to manipulate him. Okay. But he dies by the end, so that development doesn't really matter. With her getting pregnant, like I said, I think that's going to come into the next movie.
Tie into it. Yeah.
But I would have liked to have seen them do Alia.
I know. I really wanted to see that too. I'm okay with the way they handled her because I still feel like she's very much in the movie. I'm at least happy she has a huge presence and in some ways maybe more powerful presence than if they had done the child. I also think it's just the difficulty of, I mean, that's really late in the story that Alia shows up. And the movie is like a freight train at that point. So they'd kind of have to hit the brakes. I get why they did it.
Right.
I'm okay with it. I would have loved to see it though. Yeah, no doubt.
Like I'm thinking of, the spider person from the first movie and just how odd and unsettling that was, but how that's like a little detail that everyone loves.
Yeah.
Right. Cause they like took this weird swing. Give me that version of Alia. Like, yeah, it's weird and off-putting and strange and okay, so what? It's Dune. Do it.
And I think a lot about a rival too, or enemy. Some of Denis' other films where he plays a lot with the horror elements, and creepy little kid is like staple of the horror genre.
Yeah.
So I think there could have been a really impactful version of that. But more for the pacing issue, I see why they sort of chose to get away from that. Also the time jump and all of that.
Yeah. We're taking the Guild Navigators and they're reduced to like pretty much just people in a suit and you can't see past their orange smoky visor thing. And so it's like, oh, well, how are we going to do them? Well, we're just not going to. And then how are we going to do? No, we're just not going to. And even the blue eyes, I felt like they toned them way down in this movie from part one.
Yeah, they're not as like they don't stick out as much.
Yeah,
they might have just like tweaking the effect, or like if it's dark in the room,
which is fine. Like I said, all of this stuff, I'm like, that's fine. I understand. I get it. Bringing in Anya Taylor-Joy, they have to do a time jump between this one and part 3, and so I wouldn't be surprised if Ollie is part of that, if Fade's child is part of that, and Chani runs away. Who knows? She might show up with a kid or two in the next movie. When I left the theater, I thought to myself, I bet you the next movie will be called Dune Part 3 and not Dune Messiah.
I really wonder
because they're not going to do the full Dune Messiah story.
I wonder that. I do see they're like Fade Rotha versus Paul Atreides-esque knife fight between Denis Villeneuve and the executives over the title of that movie. But I don't know who will prevail.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, actually, how you felt about part 1 and part 2 as individual movies. Something I was kind of impressed by, and as everyone could tell at this point, I'm a big fan of both the movies, but I was impressed at how well I felt they had their own individual identities. I didn't feel like I was just watching the second half of part 1, but watching a film that was its own thing and had maybe even considered some of the critiques of part 1 and taken them into its design.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, it does feel like a lot of stuff is toned down. This one is infinitely more grim and serious. In the first one, I think we didn't realize how much charm Oscar Isaac and Jason Momoa were bringing to the table, where they didn't have to be goofing and joking around the whole time. But when you're left with Paul Stilgar and Gurney, you're like, oh, it's only these guys left. Like you don't have anyone who's like remotely charming. It's just the serious dudes.
Well, at least we have Shishakli, but she gets flamethrowered like a third of the way through.
Oh my gosh. I know. I was wondering when Rabin was hanging off the edge of the helicopter, I thought that was her who got thrown off.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm pretty sure that was,
and I was like,
Sute from the first Avatar movie. It's a really similar death, getting shot off the landing pad of a big flying ship.
So yeah, I just get sad that we don't have a 6-hour one movie, which I know is extremely unrealistic, and that they would never pay for one movie, and that to make that would be hell for everyone involved. But it's hard for me to see this as two stories. And like you said, and like we've already talked about, they do a real good job of showing all these different parallels,
Yeah.
I loved how before we get the production cards, we get another deep guttural, which I think the first one says dreams are
messages from the deep.
Messages from the deep. And then this one was whoever controls the spice.
Yeah, power over spice is power over all.
Right. That was even just those two opening statements. What different viewpoints we're dealing with, where in the first one, it's like more mystical and the sleeper must awaken. And in this one, it's just like militaristic and power and control. And it's like, nope, who has the spice?
Yep.
And that's what it boils down to. Nothing to do with all of these, things that we can't answer because we don't know what's going on with Paul. It's like, it's just simple power. And I thought that was also interesting. In the first one, we have, the voice and the witches and all of these things. It's like, oh, all this stuff. Oh, it's so interesting. And then the second one, it's like, nope, that's all fake. All of that is nonsense. It's all propaganda. It's all.
I mean, but is it all fake? Because in a certain way, by using the prophecy, Paul fulfills it and becomes it. And there is still the mystical elements of, the fact that they have the voice to use. And there is a key decision Paul makes to go south where he seemingly consults the desert. And I honestly, on first watch, that was one scene that I kind of raised an eyebrow at, because I was thinking, like, who is he talking to here? Like, what is the explanation behind this? And on second watch, it was like, the explanation behind this is that there is something, here that is underneath.
Definitely. Oh yeah. No, I think that there are mystical elements at play. I think that the movie is just going really far out of its way of being like, hey, this is, manipulation through people with power over people who don't have power. But then you also have Paul does drink the poison that kills men, and he lives. He comes back to life, and Chani is named,
Sahaya,
and she cries and brings him back to life, and he does see the future. Like, all of that stuff is really happening. I think that maybe they're just trying to temper that with what Herbert intended on showing to begin with,
Right. I think,
like, hey, you want this guy? You want this all-powerful guy? Well, guess what? This is what happens.
Right. I do think Denis Villeneuve is maybe injecting it with a little more of a sense of, like, true mysticism than I came away the impression of Herbert's novels. His seemed a little more scientific, but I agree. That's still, like, the central theme of Dune Part 2 is the manipulation of religion for power. And I think it's really interesting to watch the reaction to this, because there is a chunk of people who read Dune, the original book, and didn't read Dune Messiah, who never keyed into that fact that Paul wasn't the hero of the story.
Right.
And this version is like, we are not going to take that chance. We're going to hammer that home super hard.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of my only problem with the ending, is with Chani leaving silently where we don't get the conversation. You know, Paul is like, all right, let's go. What does he say? Send them to their.
Lead them to paradise.
Yeah, all right, let's go lead them to paradise, right? I didn't understand what he meant at first. I thought he was talking about still transforming Arrakis.
Right.
And I was like, oh, okay. And then I was like, oh, wait, no. He's meaning let's go kill everybody. Because of how we're used to seeing hero stories, you know, you have Fade is a psycho. He's a villain, right?
Yeah.
He's feeding livers to his female pets that he keeps around. And so when Paul beats him in the end and he gets revenge for his father and he gains all this power, I think you needed, or I mean, I didn't need because I know where the story goes. But I think to really like just a final reminder, I think you need for them to have a conversation where it's not so much Chani running away, where it really is him like, you know, you're either with me or against me. That whole, you know, Anakin, you're breaking my heart. Like, I think you need just a little bit of that. Good for Chani, you know, standing up for herself and sticking to her morals and her guns.
Yeah. To the movie's credit, watching it the second time, particularly in that final scene before she storms out and go speeding off in a worm, there's so much eye play with her.
Yeah.
There's so much emotion. And also I love this one cut back to Irulan where she's thinking like, oh my God, what am I walking into? But yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot there. I definitely see what you mean, but for me, the eyes carried the dialogue away, but I am in the Denis Villeneuve camp of no dialogue.
Right. And I agree. Like I said, like to me, I think we see evil Paul.
Yeah.
Like we see it clearly. They might be holding that out for a little bit if there's going to be a sequel where people might still have like a glimmer of hope. Or like a reason to go see the next one, you know?
Yeah.
Because they think like, oh, okay, the next one, this will be Paul on his adventures fighting the great houses and
getting his redemption.
Like I said, if they do a time jump to where Alia is played by Anya Taylor-Joy, that ain't going to be the story that they find themselves in the middle of.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how they're going to approach it, but I feel like they're very confident with whatever they're going to do because they set themselves up in such an interesting way to carry that on.
Yeah.
One thing I did want to comment on, because someone had asked me if this was the Dune for the current era, like how this Dune stands out as opposed to previous adaptations and even the original. And I think this is a good Dune adaptation for the current era. I think what really, in my mind, differentiates Dune from a lot of other fantasy, or one element that does rather, is how do I want to put this? The fact that women are really important in this universe, and that maybe sounds a little trite, but there's kind of a trope in sci-fi, going back to the original Star Wars films and countless others of the damsel in distress, or even, I guess now, we're getting a lot more diversity in our Star Wars stories, but there is something, and I don't, at the risk of maybe sounding like a little cringe portion of the internet, there is something about a lot of the diversity that does maybe feel a little corporate mandated. Whereas here,
absolutely.
Where here it feels very organic. There is the Bene Gesserit doesn't feel like it was written to include more diversity, but it is a rich, diverse element of the Dune text. And I think the way it approaches the female characters, like expanding Chani's role or choosing to, spend time with the Bene Gesserit to show their power struggles and how they manipulate the situations is a really important thing for the modern time, and makes this Dune adaptation stand out. Even a lot of Lord of the Rings comparisons, but this is a much more feminine story than Lord of the Rings. Yeah, so I would say that, and I would also just say that maybe moreover, the quality of the cinematic experience is something that is unique to this version. It's really visceral, and I think that's really essential for right now as people are kind of, movie theaters are on the edge. People are looking for a reason to see things in theaters as opposed to just home. and this Dune gives us a reason to do that. A lot of incentive.
Definitely, definitely. I saw it in IMAX today, and during the previews, I was like, this is so loud. And I go to the theater a lot. And I was like, this is so noticeably loud. And what I noticed about Dune Part 2 was more so the silence, the absolute silence when you'd have people talking, out in the desert. There's no wind, there's nothing. And I was impressed by their use of silence. It's not something that is utilized a lot in a big action movie,
I mean, part of Dune's design, I think, is to keep those quiet moments and
Mm-hmm.
even tight close-up visuals, so that when you have
Yes.
these huge noises or these big images, they just blow your mind because the contrast between the rest of the film is so huge. I'd say shout out to the Hans Zimmer score. I think the Dune
Yeah.
soundtracks are some of his better work.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, very.
I'm not the biggest Hans Zimmer dude. I gotta square with you.
I feel like Hans Zimmer is when he's on, he's on. It's just
Yeah.
not always on. But for Dune, he definitely brought his A game. Like you said, the visuals are fantastic. The sound design is great. Production value for a movie is has never been higher.
Yeah, and this is the type of if you listen to this show, you've heard me talk about 100 times about how much I hate CGI and how much I would just prefer for everything to be practical. But I would say probably apart from the worms, which I already said look great. I think they did them really, really well. Apart from the worms, nothing here feels egregious or ugly or, like I said, the spaceship stuff, it's awe inspiring. Like I look at it and I feel like, wow, like how did they do that? And then not just how they did it. I think Godzilla -1 was a great example this year for everyone as to how spending a ton of money doesn't mean that you have good style.
Right.
And if you are just talented and have good style and a good eye, that you can make something work with less money. And that's how I feel about the effects in Dune 2. Like it looks tremendous. And if I could say I had a favorite part of the movie, it would probably be how the movie looks.
Yeah.
How the movie looks, how the
Absolutely.
characters move in the real space, in the sand,
That
in all of the sets, like the production design, the special effects, the computer animation, all of those things I think are at like a 10 for me.
there's a textural element to the whole thing that is just very inviting, and that's makes it very immersive. Probably is my favorite element as well. It's just that visual textural quality to it. That's like the biggest appeal to Dune.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I was like staring at Gurney and Chani's armor
Yeah,
at the end when they're just waiting around for Paul to start fighting. I was like looking at the texture of it and I was like, oh my God, you can see it. You can look at it. Like I feel like if I reached out and touched it, I would know what it would feel like,
absolutely. And it's the same with most of the costumes, and we'd see Fade like feeling the little serrations on his knife, and you can like
Yes. Yeah.
envision what that feels like on your fingernail.
Yeah. Yeah. And after, almost 2 decades at this point of full body CGI characters, full body CGI aliens, God bless those people. Thank you for your hard work. But people like to look at something, and I feel like their team really delivered on that
And also, we've seen a couple movies in the past year that cost a lot more than Dune Part 2,
Yes.
and maybe swung a little too far with what they decided to do digitally, and ultimately cheapened themselves for it visually
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
compared to this,
Yeah.
which is a little more practical and holds up a little more
Yeah.
seamlessly. Yeah.
So we don't normally rate movies, new release stuff on these episodes, but if you had to give this movie a rating, what would you say?
So it's definitely a schmovie. I'm just kidding.
I agree.
Dune Part 2, it's it's not a perfect movie. I don't believe in such a thing as a perfect movie. I'd have nitpicks, there are little flaws, whatever.
Yeah.
But for me, if I'm going to hand out a 5-star rating, the differential there is the X factor. It's how much did this explode my brain? How much did this worm its way into my consciousness? And Dune Part 2 has cast a shadow from the future on the past 2 years of my life. And
Yeah.
I can't believe that I walked away like not only like, oh, that met my expectations, but just mind blown of what it
Yeah.
actually was. So for me, it's like, 6 out of 5 stars, masterpiece.
Wow.
11 out of 10. I can't wait to watch this movie like 900 times.
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah. I'm not sure where I'm at. The movie made me cry.
Oh, wow.
In a very unexpected way, but it was when Paul was choosing his name during the naming ceremony part.
That's great.
I actually teared up.
I teared up the most both times when we see Janice's water getting recycled. I thought that was just beautifully handled.
I love the water recycling stuff.
Yeah. Some of my favorite stuff in Dune.
Big fan. Big fan of all of that. Like, hey, don't spit. Hey, don't cry. When she was going to throw up and he's like, don't let it out. And Chani gives this look of just like, ugh, come on.
Pathetic.
How could you throw up?
Not to get too much on a personal tangent, but, I just had my first child. So it's been a long 9 months of pregnancy with my wife. She's had a little nausea issues. There was a lot of elements in this movie that I felt were made expressly for me, and that was definitely one of them. It's like, thank you, Denis.
There is something to be said. First of all, congratulations, of course.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Appreciate the shout out on the podcast, too.
Hey, oh, yeah. I wasn't sure if you'd hear that or not. I think there's something to be said. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. We want people to give concrete, this is the way that it is, ratings and reviews on everything all the time. And, there are movies that I've gone into where I just felt like I didn't want to live anymore.
Yeah.
And the movie made me feel differently. And so guess what? I love that movie.
Yeah.
And then there are movies that I went into and they just made me so mad. And I think it's okay to like have that be part of your experience and your review with the movie, as long as you can admit it yourself.
Right. Yeah. That initial impact definitely does something. That initial headspace you watch a movie in. And
yeah, like where you're at.
And I'll say for Dune, sometimes that initial headspace you see a movie in will affect the way you view that movie more than like your critical assessment of the movie.
Yeah.
And with both Dune films, I am very happy that I think critically I could defend them as, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 movies easily. And then admitting the bias, that X factor, easy 10 out of 10. No one can tell me it's not.
So yeah, that was my extremely long way of beating around the bush and saying, I think I had said the first Dune was 4 out of 5. I think I would say probably 4.5 out of 5 for me for Dune 2.
Okay. Like it a little more.
I'm not sure. I want to see it again, and I want to see it with my son. So my son's 11.
Okay.
And we just watched Dune Part 1 for the first time together. Nice. So that I can bring him to the theater. And so I want to see it with him, kind of see it through his eyes a little bit before I like really make up my mind. But
this is actually a really nice segue, and this is going to be my closing thoughts. But one critique I heard of Dune Part 1 that's really stuck with me is that it should have been rated R. It should have been more violent. I've heard a lot of people say that. They felt like it softened its punches too much. And I vehemently disagree. I think that Denis Villeneuve is a brilliant filmmaker who can make something land without being excessively graphic, can really give you that pit in your stomach. But moreover, Dune is a huge foundational movie for me. Before that, The Lord of the Rings were big ones, PG-13 films. If those had been rated R, I would have never been able to see them.
Right.
I've heard the argument made that Dune deserves to be PG-13 because it deserves to be seen by a wide audience, including young audience. But I want to flip that a little bit and say young audiences deserve movies like Dune and Dune Part 2 that are serious, dark, and don't pander to, they don't pander to a young audience, but they are accessible for them nonetheless.
I agree 100%. Like you said, they deserve it.
Yeah.
And when you look at, I mean, I watch an incredible amount of kids movies. And every time my kids reach a new age, and it's like, oh, I can finally show them, X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And I remember for me being a kid, the movies that had the biggest impact on me weren't, it wasn't like I was, 8 and watching Nightmare on Elm Street.
Right.
But it was when I was 9 and I watched The Goonies. Mm-hmm. And it was just like a little bit above what I should be watching, and then you're like 12 and you watch something that's like, should I be watching this? And these two movies I think are great movies to show not a little kid.
No.
But like you said, yeah, if they did go a little bit further and made it just a little bit more adult, it would be inaccessible. And it's good that they're not, that they're for everybody. And like when you said, oh, it should have been rated R, my brain for a second thought, wait, what are these movies rated? Because I've never thought about it, because I don't care, because I'm entertained.
Right. And it's not like, oh, a little extra blood here or there would make that way more entertaining. So
no. Awesome. Well, hey, this is great. It's 11:40 at night where I live.
Yeah, it's only 9:40 here, but that's pretty late.
We finally did it. If we get Dune Part 3 or Dune Messiah, please come back.
You can find me here. Same Dune time, same Dune channel.
Yeah. So, Paul, where can people find you online?
You can find me at Trygraptor on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, as I think it's known as now. And that's pretty much it. I'm not a real movie person. I'm just a film fan. I love Dune. I love talking about movies.
Well, you're on Letterboxd, right?
I am on Letterboxd as well, also at Trygraptor. But I'm sure you'll see me post about it on Twitter.
Well, hey, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining me for this. I didn't want to put any pressure on you. I don't like to put pressure on guests, but I was literally like, I'm not doing Dune with anyone but him. Right. So when we were trying to figure out like when we were going to do it, I like to do these episodes close to when the movie comes out. Mm-hmm. But I was like, if he can't do it, I'm going to wait. I'm not going to. Well, I'm not going to be able to find another Paul Muad'dib.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, I love the show, so it's really awesome to be on and count myself among the movie friends.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, you get to see some of the weird behind-the-scenes stuff.
The sausage is only sweeter for knowing how it's made.
Yeah. Hey, if you'd like to know how it's made, how about that for a segue? Send us an email, moviefriendspodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought about Dune 2. Let us know. What did you think? Should we have had Alia? Was there too much Rabin in this? Not enough Thiefer, however you say it? Tell me how you say it. That'd be a good email.
Gotta worm your way out of this one.
Oh, that's very good. Well, thank you again. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Seth.
And thank you very much for listening. Till next time, have a good one.
Movie Friends is produced by Seth Vargas and Michelle Rubenstein. Music by Anthony Pecora. If you like the show, please subscribe and give us a rating. It really helps us find new friends. Thanks!